Episode 688. Book Talk begins at
14 minutes and 11 seconds.
Cranford begins with episode 679.
Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania.
Episode 688. Packing Petticoats. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by our patrons, our channel members, and our premium members at craftlit.com/premium. And this week we would like to highlight Debrielle Welch, Donna Schmidt, Knit Girl, Nancy Halliday, and Susan M. Thank you so much. We could not do this without you. Oh, well, hello. How are you? I'm better today. Yay. Which is great because in several days I am going to be going down with Andrew to Washington, D.C. to see Frankenstein because lovely Craftlit listener Jean and also tour buddy of Marcy and crew, she has moved out of D.C. and left me with her tickets. I think it's a touring Shakespeare company version of Frankenstein, and I'm very curious to see if it's the same Frankenstein that Aiden and I saw years ago. I know I talked about it on the podcast when it was like a Fathom event in the States. Occasionally there's some kind of a Broadway show or an opera or something like that, an event that is broadcast live onto movie screens around the country. This was not live. Obviously, it was a pre-recorded thing, but it was spectacular. And I'm really hoping that this is the same version of Frankenstein. So I will let you know. But yeah, I have been laying very low, very, very low. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll notice that I am not on camera and wasn't on camera last week either. And that is part of why I am not doing anything that I don't absolutely have to do right now so that I can go have some fun. So that's what's up with me. How are you? I hope you are well. I hope you have gone to join in the raffle for our foundation paper piecing, the fabulous gift that we've been given by Erin, who writes these patterns. I did go download her free pattern for the book tracker, and I'm very excited to play around with this. It doesn't come with instructions because it's a pattern, not a how-to, but I did go dig around and I found some very easy instructions. So I'll make sure that I link out to those as well so that if you are interested in taking a look before you enter the raffle, you have a chance to do that. And then I'll make sure that I keep that link in the show notes so that if you win and you are not already a foundation paper piecing person, you will be able to follow along and go from there. Today, I am revisiting my buttery shortbread tea. I needed something sweet, and I didn't want to eat something sweet, but oh my good God, this tea is something else. I have no idea, truly no idea how he does what he does, but he does it, and I'm so happy. You can get a discount on some Plum Deluxe tea if you so wish by going to bit.ly/craftlit-PDTEA. That's PDT for Plum Deluxe Tea. So along with Erin sending us the foundation paper piecing raffle items for this month, I also wanted to remind you that if you win, it would be so cool if you took some video of you doing your foundation paper piecing. Remember, you don't have to worry about the audio. You could be watching TV super loud while you're doing your craft. We're going to have to cut the audio out anyway. So all it is that we care about is what are your hands doing and what's going on? And you certainly don't have to put your face on the screen. I know that can be very stressful for people. It's just your hands and what your hands are up to. And we have a link in the show notes that will give you an opportunity to tell us Again, if you have an Etsy store, if you have a blog, if you have some online charity that you want to link out to, we'll put that information on the screen in the show notes. Again, it gives you a chance to share a little bit about something that you particularly care about. Something that I particularly care about, and I know several of you feel the same way, is how the heck did women during the time of Cranford pack to go anywhere? Because the dresses, I mean, just packing to travel in the wintertime now, where I am mostly just wearing jeans and t-shirts or jeans and shirts, I wind up having to carry a big bag. Okay, of course, some of that is yarn and knitting patterns and whatever paper piecing I'm working on. I know. But still, these women probably also traveled with knitting, for goodness sake. So how? In fact, we know Mary Smith does travel with knitting because she's knitting in Cranford. Ha! I am vindicated. So, how did they pull this off? Well, I'll tell you. I found it started with, I sound like all I do is watch videos during the day, and I'm not watching. I'm listening and occasionally glancing up. I can't look at the screens, and I can't always focus enough on a audiobook to be able to track it when my brain is having a bad day. But I find that the brevity of YouTube essays, the audio portion of those essays, is soothing enough and engaging enough that I kind of pop in and out and pay attention as I can. And it's very little tax on my brain, which doesn't sound like a ringing endorsement. But I did have something pop in my feed on Victorian train travel versus modern train travel by a YouTuber named Kaz. She recommended going and watching Nicole Rudolph's video on women packing for train travel in the Victorian era and how the traveling trunks worked. I will tell you this. I didn't get all of my questions answered, but I got a lot of them answered. And I'll give you just one. Traveling by ship across the Atlantic, how the heck did you deal with the luggage requirements? And the answer is this. You would pack 2 trunks. You would pack one trunk that was just shipboard clothing. You would leave that when you disembark at left luggage with the ship company. You would take your other trunk, your travel trunk, and you would go traveling your way across wherever you are. When you come back, you would have White Star Lines or whoever stow your travel trunk, retrieve your shipboard trunk, and take that to your room. All of a sudden I went, oh, there were systems that we know nothing about because there aren't enough writers like Elizabeth Gaskell who tell us how things work. I thought you also might be interested. I really appreciated it. But then the next one that got fed is, you know how everybody says, well, women in the United States at least weren't allowed to get credit cards until the 1970s without their husband signing for them. And it turns out that is true-ish, but not 100% true. And as soon as she started talking about it, this was also Nicole Rudolph. As soon as she started talking about it, I went, oh, we actually know this. We craftlit people know this because we've seen people in books from this era and earlier who buy things at dry goods stores on credit. So it turns out that kind of credit and then eventually layaway was the way women shopped, really. Especially if you were a farmer or the wife of a farmer or part of a farming family, you wouldn't get paid necessarily until your harvest. So you're going to be buying stuff on credit for a good chunk of the year. And then when the harvest comes in, you pay off all your bills and you start over again. And it's not a bad thing. That's just life. So her credit card history video I found fascinating. She really did some interesting digging. So yeah, I thought you might like that. So I have all those videos linked out to in the show notes. I'm sure she has some beautiful video and photographs that she puts on the screen. I didn't watch them all. I was really pretty much just listening. So you don't have to watch. And eventually, someday, my brain will be able to do audiobooks again more frequently, and I'll be able to tell you about those. Oh, and I think I wanted to make sure I said it here as well. I think this episode times out with the upcoming Moby Dick. If you are listening to Moby Dick in real time, and I really recommend you do, actually, because you're going to wind up wanting to listen to most chapters more than once, so you'll still kind of keep it fresh in your head. If you are listening to Moby Dick, I gave you homework, and the homework was go read the story of Jonah and the whale, and then go read some scholarly work on Jonah and the whale. And I recommended specifically a reformedjewish.org's take on the Jonah story, because I think it's an Old Testament prophet book. And sometimes it's good to hear how the people who've continued those traditions see their stories. Every so often, there's a kind of a Christian read on some of these stories that's missing part of the history. Like they miss what was going on with the Persians and the Babylonians and the Greeks. Sometimes they get it dead right because there are plenty of excellent Christian scholars, but sometimes they miss it, and it's always frustrating. So start with the Jewish take and then go add to it. And share your favorite things with me too. And again, you can call 206-350-1642. You can call directly from the app. If you listened on the app, go to the sidebar, go to the extras, and contact the show is one of the options. You can email heather@craftlit.com. You can go to speakpipe.com/craftlit and share your 2 cents with me. The other thing that I mention as homework but more fun is, if you get a chance, and this is for everybody, if you get a chance, go watch the Gregory Peck version of Moby Dick, just the Father Mapple sermon. It's Orson Welles being this blustery, like Old Testament Wrath of God type preacher. But if you've never seen the movie, if you've never read the book, I am not going to spoil it for you. I am going to tell you, however, that the set they built for Orson Welles is directly taken from the book, and that the real life chapel in New Bedford actually built it after the book came out. The book was popular enough that they wanted to match the book. It was like a claim to fame. Hey, New Bedford's in a new book. Let's do that. So they built this pulpit that's described in depth in Moby Dick. It didn't exist before that. It should have, but it didn't. I think there's a lot of stuff in Moby Dick where you're like, oh, that should have been real. Darn. I will tell you this, though. The real one in New Bedford is quaint and adorable. The one Orson Welles is on is fabulous. It's worth just seeing him do that sermon, 'cause it's Orson freaking Welles. Oh, he's so marvelous. And along with Moby Dick, don't forget, if you are listening to the fabulous BJ Harrison. He's got a new thing coming up. Or I think it's now live. It's basically his entire Classic Tales Audiobooks library set up as audiobooks, not as podcast episodes. And for $6.99 a month, you can stream or download the entire thing. He has won awards. He has the most marvelous voice. They are unlimited listening options. It is no limits, no fees. He's calling it the Audiobook Library Card, and that is the website, audiobooklibrarycard.com. I am so excited that both we got BJ's Moby Dick for our going through the book, because what a treat that is. But also, I'm so excited that I get to share that with you, because BJ's been doing this almost as long as I have, and he's just great. He's great, and he has a beautiful voice. All right. So last week, chapter 9, we introduced Signor Brunoni, and we got to watch Miss Pole Magicsplaining how to magic while Signor Brunoni is doing the magic. I am here to tell you, Miss Pole only gets worse in this chapter. I think the only reason I was able to handle Miss Pole in this chapter without throwing the book out the window is because it's very clear that Elizabeth Gaskell disapproves of Miss Pole's behavior as well. So she's telling it to us, but she is making sure that we know that she knows, and she knows that we know that she knows. See what I did there? That this was unacceptable behavior. It's just not done. So things to know before we dive into this chapter, which is called The Panic. Remember, doctors are also dentists. Don't forget that. It'll pay off at the end of the chapter. As I said, you can tell that Miss Gaskell is not really approving of Miss Pole's behavior. There's a lot of kind of Gaskell's under the wire commentary in this chapter, very much the same way that we got in Your Ladyship, where we could tell how she felt about the manservant and his ferocious tude, and how Lady Glenmire and Mrs. Jamieson were behaving or not behaving. More like that in this chapter. Also, do know the panic that you see experienced in this chapter. This was a common fear. It was a common fear everywhere. It's just unique that this has come to Cranford, and especially around this class of women. Because we know, for one thing, that this class of women, they are elegantly austere. They don't have a lot. Certainly Mrs. Forrester and Mrs. Jamieson have larger houses and more nice things than most of the women, but there's not a lot there. Also, don't forget that the French fought with the colonists against Britain in the Revolutionary War. If you watched Hamilton, you know Lafayette. So that's a thing to know, but also know that the Brits didn't just fight the French here in the United States during the Revolutionary War. They also fought the French in Spain during the Peninsular War from 1808 to 1815. That was a Napoleonic war. And that Napoleon really, truly, and understandably made everybody in England very jumpy, and they were very worried about spies. This is not something that is unique to Cranford. It is ridiculous in Cranford because they're in the middle of the country next to Manchester or Drumble, and the chance of there being Napoleonic spies anywhere further in from the coast than like 10 miles is a little ridiculous, but it wasn't outrageous for people to be worried. It certainly would have been in the newspapers at the time, and people definitely would have been talking about it. I have some pictures for you in the show notes. There's Madame de Staël, who was amazing. She's really, I I I really need to look up this woman and find out more, because apparently Miss Gaskell had a friend who was friends with Madame de Staël, and therefore Mrs. Gaskell heard about this woman go riding across Asia Minor dressed as a Turkish horseman, turban, pistols, the whole shebang. And there is a portrait done of her by a man named Denon, and Denon was an art expert who traveled with Napoleon to Egypt. One of his famous sketches is of a man in a turban. He's the one who painted her. She is also in a turban. The turban thing matters, sort of, but the reference about turbans is to her in a turban, meaning this painting, and Denon, the artist, with turbans, which is the sketch that I've included in the show notes. So that's all it is that this was a famous enough painting, and he was a famous enough painter, sketcher, artist that everybody knew about this. You will hear a reference to spoons. Just remember, the spoons are probably, no, they're not even probably, they're definitely silver. There's a reference to Philomel, Philomel. This is a Greek myth. And the way that they talk about Philomel in this book does not match the really quite upsetting Greek myth. Instead, it sounds like Mary Smith or Mrs. Gaskell is using Philomel as a name to stand in for the word nightingale, because she's already said the word nightingale earlier, like one sentence earlier, and Gaskell, being a very good writer, wouldn't want to repeat it twice, so she uses Philomel, which apparently is the Greek word for nightingale. I'm taking that on trust. I don't know, but that's my guess. So if you know your Greek myths and you're like, wow, you're bringing up Philomel, I don't think it's because she's trying to sub-reference the story. I think she's just using the word. There's also reference to what I think must have been kind of a proto-urban legend, except it's more like a suburban or a country legend. It's a story, and you will hear it touched on. A young serving girl who's left in charge of a great house in Cumberland. Everybody goes off to the fair for the day. She's left alone. Drama ensues. Bad, scary, wow stuff. I'm thinking it's like, the stories about the Hook and things like that. However, This story was originally written down at some point. I think it had already been making the rounds before that, though. And when it was written down as having happened in Scotland. And that's why I think this was just one of those spreads like wildfire urban legend things that may have had some kind of basis in reality, but probably not so much. I'm sure it's like a game of telephone. It was probably a girl who was left alone and got scared. The end. And then, the big story grows up around it. Don't forget that Carlo is the name of Mrs. Jamieson's very unpleasant cream-eating dog or cream-drinking dog. You just need to remember who Carlo is. You will hear a reference to a mysterious, quote-unquote, deadly force. This is a reference to kind of proto-mesmerism, that sort of thing, like stories about doctors in the late 18th century who had through the exertion of the will that would go through their eyes, or it was their gaze was commonly believed to be potentially powerful. And in fact, the story is so universal at this point that George III's doctor, Francis Willis, was said to have been able to exert control over poor George III when he was having an episode as a way to get him back into a straitjacket. If he was, acting out and being uncontrollable, this doctor could come and use the force of his gaze to mesmerize George III and calm him down long enough so that the orderlies could get him into a straitjacket. So that's not weird. It's not weird that people would be taking this as read. Like, this is a fact that can happen. Cheltenham, which I have never been to. It's adjacent to the Cotswolds in Gloucestershire in England, and it was famous for being a spa town. I don't know if it still is a spa town. Somebody tell me, because the pictures I saw of it were lovely. Virago is a domineering or bad-tempered woman. I think we've come across that before. Videlicet, Videlicet, or if you are going to pronounce it apparently correctly in Latin, wi-del-eh-ket. That is a Latin adverb meaning namely, or that is to say, or as follows. This is often used in legal, academic, or formal writing. It's definitely used in vindications on the rights of women. It is definitely used in Moll Flanders. All over the place is viz. And viz, V-I-Z, is the abbreviated version of Videlicet. The word comes from a contraction, actually, of videre and licet, meaning it is permitted to see, or one may see. So it's like, him, he studies all the classics, viz Latin and Greek, which is he studies the classics. That is to say, he studies Latin and Greek. It's just, you can imagine writing with a quill pen, anything you can do to make things go easier on you. And then there are two doctors mentioned towards the end. Dr. John Ferrier, who lived from 1761 to 1815, so he's already gone by the time this book is taking place. He's the author of an essay and the essay is Towards a Theory of Apparitions, and that was published 2 years before he died in 1813. And then there's a Dr. Samuel Hibbard, and Hibbard was around from 1782 to 1848, so he was still alive when this was supposed to be taking place, but not when Mrs. Gaskell was writing it. He wrote a book called Sketches of the Philosophy of Apparitions, or, so now it's the subtitle, An Attempt to Trace Such Illusions to Their Physical Causes. And that was published in 1825. So as the subtitle of Hibbart's book indicates, both of these guys were skeptical about the existence of ghosts. They felt that there were very clear, sensible explanations for what other people saw as being ghosts. And that is everything you need to listen to Chapter 10 of Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. If you are not listening to our Noel Badrian version, you can fast wind to 59 minutes and 29 seconds. All right, here we go.
Chapter 10 of Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Noel Badrian. The Panic. I think a series of circumstances dated from Signor Brunoni's visit to Cranford, which seemed at the time connected in our minds with him, though I don't know that he had anything really to do with them. All at once, all sorts of uncomfortable rumours got afloat in the town. There were 1 or 2 robberies, real bona fide robberies, men had up before the magistrates and committed for trial, and that seemed to make us all afraid of being robbed. And for a long time, at Miss Mattie's, I know, we used to make a regular expedition all round the kitchens and cellars every night. Miss Mattie leading the way, armed with the poker, I following with the horse-brush, and Martha carrying the shovel and fire-irons with which to sound the alarm. And by the accidental hitting together of them, she often frightened us so much that we bolted ourselves up, all 3 together, in the back kitchen or storeroom, or wherever we happened to be, till, when our fright was over, we recollected ourselves, and set out afresh with double valiance. By day we heard strange stories from the shopkeepers and cottagers, of carts that went about in the dead of night, drawn by horses shod with felt, and guarded by men in dark clothes, going round the town, no doubt in search of some unwatched house or some unfastened door. Miss Pole, who affected great bravery herself, was the principal person to collect and arrange these reports so as to make them assume their most fearful aspect. But we discovered that she had begged one of Mr. Hoggins's worn-out hats to hang up in her lobby, and we, at least I, had doubts as to whether she really would enjoy the little adventure of having her house broken into, as she protested she would. Miss Mattie made no secret of being an arrant coward, but she went regularly through her housekeeper's duty of inspection. Only the hour for this became earlier and earlier, till at last we went the rounds at 6:30, and Miss Mattie adjourned to bed soon after 7, in order to get the night over the sooner. Cranford had so long piqued itself on being an honest and moral town that it had grown to fancy itself too genteel and well-bred to be otherwise, and felt the stain upon its character at this time doubly. But we comforted ourselves with the assurance which we gave to each other that the robberies could never have been committed by any Cranford person. It must have been a stranger or strangers who brought this disgrace upon the town, and occasioned as many precautions as if we were living among the Red Indians or the French. This last comparison of our nightly state of defence and fortification was made by Mrs. Forrester, whose father had served under General Burgoyne in the American War, and whose husband had fought the French in Spain. She indeed inclined to the idea that, in some way, the French were connected with the small thefts, which were ascertained facts, and the burglaries and highway robberies, which were rumours. She had been deeply impressed with the idea of French spies at some time in her life, and the notion could never be fairly eradicated, but sprang up again from time to time, and now her theory was this. The Cranford people respected themselves too much, and were too grateful to the aristocracy who were so kind as to live near the town, ever to disgrace their bringing up by being dishonest or immoral. Therefore we must believe that the robbers were strangers. If strangers, why not foreigners? If foreigners, who so likely as the French? Signor Brunoni spoke broken English like a Frenchman, and, though he wore a turban like a Turk, Mrs. Forrester had seen a print of Madame de Staël with a turban on, and another of Mr. Denon, in just such a dress as that in which the conjurer had made his appearance, showing clearly that the French, as well as the Turks, wore turbans. There could be no doubt Signor Brunoni was a Frenchman, a French spy come to discover the weak and undefended places of England, and doubtless he had his accomplices. For her part, she, Mrs. Forrester, had always had her own opinion of Miss Pole's adventure at the George Inn, seeing 2 men where only one was believed to be. French people had ways and means which she was thankful to say the English knew nothing about, and she had never felt quite easy in her mind about going to see that conjurer. It was rather too much like a forbidden thing, though the rector was there. In short, Mrs. Forrester grew more excited than we had ever known her before, and, being an officer's daughter and widow, we looked up to her opinion, of course. Really, I do not know how much was true or false in the reports, which flew about like wildfire just at this time, but it seemed to me then that there was every reason to believe that at Marden, a small town about 8 miles from Cranford, houses and shops were entered by holes made in the walls, the bricks being silently carried away in the dead of the night, and all done so quietly that no sound was heard either in or out of the house. Miss Matty gave it up in despair when she heard of this. "What was the use," said she, "of locks and bolts and bells to the windows, and going round the house every night?" That last trick was fit for a conjurer. Now she did believe that Signor Brunoni was at the bottom of it. One afternoon, about 5 o'clock, we were startled by a hasty knock at the door. Miss Matty bade me run and tell Martha on no account to open the door till she, Miss Matty, had reconnoitred through the window, and she armed herself with a footstool to drop down on the head of the visitor in case he should show a face covered with black crape as he looked up in answer to her inquiry of who was there. But it was nobody but Miss Pole and Betty. The former came upstairs carrying a little hand-basket, and she was evidently in a state of great agitation. "Take care of that," said she to me, as I offered to relieve her of her basket. "It's my plate. I am sure there is a plan to rob my house tonight. I am come to throw myself on your hospitality, Miss Matty. Betty is going to sleep with her cousin at the George. I can sit up here all night if you will allow me, but my house is so far from any neighbours, and I don't believe we could be heard if we screamed ever so." "But," said Miss Matty, "what has alarmed you so much? Have you seen any men lurking about the house?" "Oh yes," answered Miss Pole. "2 very bad-looking men have gone 3 times past the house, very slowly. And an Irish beggar-woman came not half an hour ago, and all but forced herself in past Betty, saying her children were starving, and she must speak to the mistress. You see, she said, 'Mistress,' though there was a hat hanging up in the hall, and it would have been more natural to have said 'Master.' But Betty shut the door in her face and came up to me, and we got the spoons together and sat in the parlour window watching till we saw Thomas Jones going from his work, when we called to him and asked him to take care of us into the town." We might have triumphed over Miss Pole, who had professed such bravery until she was frightened, but we were too glad to perceive that she shared in the weakness of humanity to exult over her, and I gave up my room to her very willingly, and shared Miss Matty's bed for the night. But before we retired, the 2 ladies rummaged up, out of the recesses of their memory, such horrid stories of robbery and murder that I quite quaked in my shoes. Miss Pole was evidently anxious to prove that such terrible events had occurred within her experience that she was justified in her sudden panic. And Miss Matty did not like to be outdone, and capped every story with one yet more horrible, till it reminded me, oddly enough, of an old story I had read somewhere, of a nightingale and a musician, who strove one against the other, which could produce the most admirable music, till poor Philomel dropped down dead. One of the stories that haunted me for a long time afterwards was of a girl who was left in charge of a great house in Cumberland on some particular fair day, when the other servants all went off to the gaieties. The family were away in London, and a pedlar came by and asked to leave his large and heavy pack in the kitchen, saying he would call for it again at night. And the girl, a gamekeeper's daughter, roaming about in search of amusement, chanced to hit upon a gun hanging up in the hall, and took it down to look at the chasing, and it went off through the open kitchen door, hit the pack, and a slow dark thread of blood came oozing out. How Miss Pole enjoyed this part of the story, dwelling on each word as if she loved it. She rather hurried over the further account of the girl's bravery, and I have but a confused idea that somehow she baffled the robbers with Italian irons, heated red-hot and then restored to blackness by being dipped in grease. We parted for the night with an awe-stricken wonder as to what we should hear of in the morning, and, on my part, with a vehement desire for the night to be over and gone. I was so afraid lest the robbers should have seen from some dark lurking-place that Miss Pole had carried off her plate, and thus have a double motive for attacking our house. But until Lady Glenmire came to call next day, we heard of nothing unusual. The kitchen fire-irons were in exactly the same position against the back door as when Martha and I had skilfully piled them up like spillikins, ready to fall with an awful clatter if only a cat had touched the outside panels. I had wondered what we should all do if thus awakened and alarmed, and had proposed to Miss Matty that we should cover up our faces under the bedclothes so that there should be no danger of the robbers thinking that we could identify them. But Miss Matty, who was trembling very much, scouted this idea, and said we owed it to society to apprehend them, and that she should certainly do her best to lay hold of them and lock them up in the garret till morning. When Lady Glenmire came, we almost felt jealous of her. Mrs. Jamieson's house had really been attacked. At least there were men's footsteps to be seen on the flower borders underneath the kitchen windows, where nay men should be, and Carlo had barked all through the night as if strangers were abroad. Mrs. Jamieson had been awakened by Lady Glenmire, and they had rung the bell which communicated with Mr. Mulliner's room in the third story, and when his night-capped head had appeared over the banisters in answer to their summons, they had told him of their alarm and the reasons for it, whereupon he retreated into his bedroom and locked the door, for fear of draughts, as he informed them in the morning, and opened the window and called out valiantly to say, if the supposed robbers would come to him, he would fight them. But, as Lady Glenmire observed, that was but poor comfort, since they would have to pass by Mrs. Jamieson's room and her own before they could reach him, and must be of a very pugnacious disposition indeed if they neglected the opportunities of robbery presented by the unguarded lower stories to go up to a garret, and there force a door in order to get at the champion of the house. Lady Glenmire, after waiting and listening for some time in the drawing-room, had proposed to Mrs. Jamieson that they should go to bed, but that lady said she should not feel comfortable unless she sat up and watched, and accordingly she packed herself warmly up on the sofa, where she was found by the housemaid when she came into the room at 6 o'clock, fast asleep. But Lady Glenmire went to bed and kept awake all night. When Miss Pole heard of this, she nodded her head in great satisfaction. She had been sure we should hear of something happening in Cranford that night, and we had heard. It was clear enough they had first proposed to attack her house, but when they saw that she and Betty were on their guard and had carried off the plate, they had changed their tactics and gone to Mrs. Jamieson's, and no one knew what might have happened if Carlo had not barked like a good dog as he was. Poor Carlo, his barking days were nearly over. Whether the gang who infested the neighbourhood were afraid of him, or whether they were revengeful enough for the way in which he had baffled them on the night in question to poison him, or whether, as some among the more uneducated people thought, he died of apoplexy, brought on by too much feeding and too little exercise, at any rate, it is certain that 2 days after this eventful night, Carlo was found dead, with his poor little legs stretched out stiff in the attitude of running, as if by such unusual exertion he could escape the sure pursuer, death. We were all sorry for Carlo, the old familiar friend who had snapped at us for so many years, and the mysterious mode of his death made us very uncomfortable. Could Signor Brunoni be at the bottom of this? He had apparently killed a canary with only a word of command. His will seemed of deadly force. Who knew but what he might yet be lingering in the neighbourhood, willing all sorts of awful things? We whispered these fancies among ourselves in the evenings. But in the mornings our courage came back with the daylight, and in a week's time we had got over the shock of Carlo's death, all but Mrs. Jamieson. She, poor thing, felt it as if she had felt no event since her husband's death. Indeed, Miss Pole said that, as the Honourable Mr. Jamieson drank a good deal and occasioned her much uneasiness, it was possible that Carlo's death might be the greater affliction. But there was always a tinge of cynicism in Miss Pole's remarks. However, one thing was clear and certain. It was necessary for Mrs. Jamieson to have some change of scene, and Mr. Mulliner was very impressive on this point, shaking his head whenever we inquired after his mistress, and speaking of her loss of appetite and bad nights very ominously, and with justice too, for if she had two characteristics in her natural state of health, they were a facility of eating and sleeping. If she could neither eat nor sleep, she must be indeed out of spirits and out of health. Lady Glenmire, who had evidently taken very kindly to Cranford, did not like the idea of Mrs. Jamieson going to Cheltenham, and more than once insinuated pretty plainly that it was Mr. Mulliner's doing, who had been much alarmed on the occasion of the house being attacked, and since had said more than once that he felt it a very responsible charge to have to defend so many women. Be that as it might, Mrs. Jamieson went to Cheltenham, escorted by Mr. Mulliner, and Lady Glenmire remained in possession of the house, her ostensible office being to take care that the maidservants did not pick up followers. She made a very pleasant-looking dragon, and, as soon as it was arranged for her stay in Cranford, she found out that Mrs. Jamieson's visit to Cheltenham was just the best thing in the world. She had let her house in Edinburgh, and was for the time houseless, so the charge of her sister-in-law's comfortable abode was very convenient and acceptable. Miss Pole was very much inclined to install herself as a heroine, because of the decided steps she had taken in flying from the 2 men and 1 woman, whom she entitled that murderous gang. She described their appearance in glowing colours, and I noticed that every time she went over the story, some fresh trait of villainy was added to their appearance. One was tall. He grew to be gigantic in height before we had done with him. He, of course, had black hair, and by it hung in elf-locks over his forehead and down his back. The other was short and broad, and a hump sprouted out of his shoulders before we heard the last of him. He had red hair, which deepened into carroty, and she was almost sure he had a cast in the eye, a decided squint. As for the woman, her eyes glared, and she was masculine-looking, a perfect virago, most probably a man dressed in woman's clothes. Afterwards we heard of a beard on her chin, and a manly voice, and a stride. If Miss Pole was delighted to recount the events of that afternoon to all inquirers, others were not so proud of their adventures in the robbery line. Mr. Hoggins, the surgeon, had been attacked at his own door by 2 ruffians who were concealed in the shadow of the porch, and so effectually silenced him that he was robbed in the interval between ringing his bell and the servants answering it. Miss Pole was sure it would turn out that his robbery had been committed by her men, and went the very day she heard the report to have her teeth examined and to question Mr. Hoggins. She came to us afterwards, so we heard what she had heard straight and direct from the source, while we were yet in the excitement and flutter of the agitation caused by the first intelligence, for the event had only occurred the night before. "Well," said Miss Pole, sitting down with the decision of a person who has made up her mind as to the nature of life and the world, and such people never tread lightly or seat themselves without a bump. Well, Miss Matty, men will be men. Every mother's son of them wishes to be considered Samson and Solomon rolled into one, too strong ever to be beaten or discomfited, too wise ever to be outwitted. If you will notice, they have always foreseen events, though they never tell one for one's warning before the events happen. My father was a man, and I know the sex pretty well. She had talked herself out of breath, and we should have been very glad to fill up the necessary pause as chorus, but we did not know exactly what to say, or which man had suggested this diatribe against the sex, so we only joined in generally with a grave shake of the head and a soft murmur of, "They are very incomprehensible, certainly." "Now, only think," said she. "There, I have undergone the risk of having one of my remaining teeth drawn, for one is terribly at the mercy of any surgeon-dentist, and I, for one, always speak them fair till I have got my mouth out of their clutches. And after all, Mr. Hoggins is too much of a man to own that he was robbed last night." "Not robbed!" exclaimed the chorus. "Don't tell me," Miss Pole exclaimed, angry that we could be for a moment imposed upon. "I believe he was robbed, just as Betty told me, and he is ashamed to own it. And, to be sure, it was very silly of him to be robbed just at his own door. I dare say he feels that such a thing won't raise him in the eyes of Cranford society, and is anxious to conceal it. But he need not have tried to impose upon me by saying that I must have heard an exaggerated account of some petty theft of a neck of mutton, which, it seems, was stolen out of the safe in his yard last week. He had the impertinence to add he believed that that was taken by the cat. I have no doubt if I could get at the bottom of it, it was the Irishman dressed up in women's clothes who came spying about my house with the story about the starving children." After we had duly condemned the want of candour which Mr. Hoggins had evinced, and abused men in general, taking him for the representative and type, we got round to the subject about which we had been talking when Miss Pole came in, namely, how far in the present disturbed state of the country we could venture to accept an invitation which Miss Matty had just received from Mrs. Forrester to come as usual and keep the anniversary of her wedding day by drinking tea with her at 5 o'clock and playing a quiet pool afterwards. Mrs. Forrester had said that she asked us with some diffidence because the roads were, she feared, very unsafe. But she suggested that perhaps one of us would not object to take the sedan, and that the others, by walking briskly, might keep up with the long trot of the chairman, and so we might all arrive safely at Overplace, a suburb of the town. No, that is too large an expression, a small cluster of houses separated from Cranford by about 200 yards of a dark and lonely lane. There was no doubt but that a similar note was awaiting Miss Pole at home, so her call was a very fortunate affair, as it enabled us to consult together. We would all much rather have declined this invitation, but we felt that it would not be quite kind to Mrs. Forrester, who would otherwise be left to a solitary retrospect of her not very happy or fortunate life. Miss Matty and Miss Pole had been visitors on this occasion for many years, and now they gallantly determined to nail their colours to the mast and to go through Darkness Lane, rather than fail in loyalty to their friend. But when the evening came, Miss Matty, for it was she who was voted into the chair, as she had a cold, before being shut down in the sedan, like Jack-in-a-box, implored the chairman, whatever might befall, not to run away and leave her fastened up there, to be murdered, and even after they had promised, I saw her tighten her features into the stern determination of a martyr, and she gave me a melancholy and ominous shake of the head through the glass. However, we got there safely, only rather out of breath, for it was who could trot the hardest through Darkness Lane, and I am afraid poor Miss Matty was sadly jolted. Mrs. Forrester had made extra preparations in acknowledgment of our exertion in coming to see her through such dangers. The usual forms of genteel ignorance as to what her servant might send up were all gone through, and harmony and preference seemed likely to be the order of the evening, but for an interesting conversation that began, I don't know how, but which had relation, of course, to the robbers who infested the neighbourhood of Cranford. Having braved the dangers of Darkness Lane, and thus having a little stock of reputation for courage to fall back upon, and also, I dare say, desirous of proving ourselves superior to men, Videlicet Mr. Hoggins, in the article of candour we began to relate our individual fears, and the private precautions we each of us took. I own that my pet apprehension was eyes looking at me and watching me, glittering out from some dull, flat wooden surface, and that if I dared to go up to my looking-glass when I was panic-stricken, I should certainly turn it round with its back towards me for fear of seeing eyes behind me looking out of the darkness. I saw Miss Matty nerving herself up for a confession, and at last out it came. She owned that ever since she had been a girl, she had dreaded being caught by her last leg just as she was getting into bed, by someone concealed under it. She said when she was younger and more active, she used to take a flying leap from a distance, and so bring both her legs up safely into bed at once. But that this had always annoyed Deborah, who piqued herself upon getting into bed gracefully, and she had given it up in consequence. But now the old terror would often come over her, especially since Miss Pole's house had been attacked. We had got quite to believe in the fact of the attack having taken place. And yet it was very unpleasant to think of looking under a bed and seeing a man concealed with a great fierce face staring out at you. So she had bethought herself of something. Perhaps I had noticed she had told Martha to buy her a penny ball, such as children play with. And now she rolled this ball under the bed every night. If it came out on the other side, well and good. If not, she always took care to have her hand on the bell-rope, and meant to call out John and Harry, just as if she expected men-servants to answer her ring. We all applauded this ingenious contrivance, and Miss Matty sank back into satisfied silence, with a look at Mrs. Forrester as if to ask for her private weakness. Mrs. Forrester looked askance at Miss Pole, and tried to change the subject a little by telling us that she had borrowed a boy from one of the neighbouring cottages, and promised his parents 100 weight of coals at Christmas, and his supper every evening, for the loan of him at nights. She had instructed him in his possible duties when he first came, and finding him sensible, she had given him the Major's sword. The Major was her late husband, and desired him to put it very carefully behind his pillow at night, turning the edge towards the head of the pillow. He was a sharp lad, she was sure, for, spying out the Major's cocked hat, he had said if he might have that to wear, he was sure he could frighten 2 Englishmen or 4 Frenchmen any day. But she had impressed upon him anew that he was to lose no time in putting on hats or anything else, but if he heard any noise, he was to run at it with his drawn sword. On my suggestion that some accident might occur from such slaughterous and indiscriminate directions, and that he might rush on Jenny, getting up to wash, and have spitted her before he had discovered that she was not a Frenchman, Mrs. Forrester said she did not think that that was likely, for he was a very sound sleeper, and generally had to be well shaken or cold-pigged in the morning before they could rouse him. She sometimes thought such dead sleep must be owing to the hearty suppers the poor lad ate, for he was half-starved at home, and she told Jenny to see that he got a good meal at night. Still, this was no confession of Mrs. Forrester's peculiar timidity, and we urged her to tell us what she thought would frighten her more than anything. She paused, and stirred the fire, and snuffed the candles, and then she said, in a sounding whisper, "Ghosts." She looked at Miss Pole as much as to say she had declared it, and would stand by it. Such a look was a challenge in itself. Miss Pole came down upon her with indigestion, spectral illusions, optical delusions, and a great deal out of Dr. Ferrier and Dr. Hibbard besides. Miss Matty had rather a leaning to ghosts, as I have mentioned before, and what little she did say was all on Mrs. Forrester's side, who, emboldened by sympathy, protested that ghosts were a part of her religion, and surely she, the widow of a major in the army, knew what to be frightened at, and what not. In short, I never saw Mrs. Forrester so warm either before or since, for she was a gentle, meek, enduring old lady in most things. Not all the elder wine that ever was mulled could this night wash out the remembrance of this difference between Miss Pole and her hostess. Indeed, when the elder wine was brought in, it gave rise to a new burst of discussion, for Jenny, the little maiden who staggered under the tray, had to give evidence of having seen a ghost with her own eyes not so many nights ago in Darkness Lane, the very lane we were to go through on our way home. In spite of the uncomfortable feeling which this last consideration gave me, I could not help being amused at Jenny's position, which was exceedingly like that of a witness being examined and cross-examined by two counsel, who are not at all scrupulous about asking leading questions. The conclusion I arrived at was that Jenny had certainly seen something beyond what a fit of indigestion would have caused. A lady, all in white, and without her head, was what she deposed and adhered to, supported by a consciousness of the secret sympathy of her mistress under the withering scorn with which Miss Pole regarded her. And not only she, but many others had seen this headless lady, who sat by the roadside wringing her hands as in deep grief. Mrs. Forrester looked at us from time to time with an air of conscious triumph, but then she had not to pass through Darkness Lane before she could bury herself beneath her own familiar bedclothes. We preserved a discreet silence as to the headless lady while we were putting on our things to go home, for there was no knowing how near the ghostly head and ears might be, or what spiritual connection they might be keeping up with the unhappy body in Darkness Lane, and therefore even Miss Pole felt that it was well not to speak lightly on such subjects, for fear of vexing or insulting that woe-begone trunk. At least so I conjecture, for instead of the busy clatter usual in the operation, we tied on our cloaks as sadly as mutes at a funeral. Miss Matty drew the curtains round the windows of the chair to shut out disagreeable sights, and the men, either because they were in spirits that their labours were so nearly ended, or because they were going downhill, set off at such a round and merry pace that it was all Miss Pole and I could do to keep up with them. She had breath for nothing beyond an imploring, "Don't leave me," uttered as she clutched my arm so tightly that I could not have quitted her, ghost or no ghost. What a relief it was when the men, weary of their burden and their quick trot, stopped just where Headingley Causeway branches off from Darkness Lane. Miss Pole unloosed me and caught at one of the men. Could not you take Miss Matty round by Headingley Causeway? The pavement in Darkness Lane jolts so, and she is not very strong." A smothered voice was heard from the inside of the chair. "Oh, pray go on. What is the matter? What is the matter? I will give you 6pence more to go on very fast. Play don't stop here." "And I'll give you a shilling," said Miss Pole with tremulous dignity, "if you'll go by Headingley Causeway." The two men grunted acquiescence and took up the chair and went along the causeway, which certainly answered Miss Pole's kind purpose of saving Miss Matty's bones, for it was covered with soft thick mud, and even a fall there would have been easy till the getting up came, when there might have been some difficulty in extrication. End of chapter 10.
So Miss Matty gets to go home in the chair. I thought it was really lovely that they stop the guys from going on a shortcut, but one that would have been very uneven ground and would have been very jarring for Miss Maddie, and they're willing to pay them extra for that. I love this town. I also loved getting a chance to see that that women back in this time period were no different from girls at a sleepover in elementary school who just tell each other China doll stories and all sorts of scary Bloody Mary stories. Nothing changes. Humans are humans. I also thought that as annoying as Miss Pole was during the middle part of this chapter, her idea of hanging a man's hat in the hallway where it could easily be seen, that was super smart. I mean, it's not like anybody local wouldn't know that there's no man living there, but somebody who just came into town, he wouldn't know any better. So there's that. I also loved Miss Maddie saying she was going to bed earlier to get the night over with. There's a really similar moment to that in Moby Dick in chapter 4, where he's like, well, I guess I'll try and go to sleep so this will all get over with sooner. I also loved that one of the comments was, no doubt Signor Brunoni was a Frenchman, which is hysterical because it must be a spy, a French spy, because Napoleon, ignoring the fact that his name is Signor Brunoni. And I suppose the Italian, Signor, Signor, instead of Sin with the tilde or. Either way, Spanish or Italian, he is not Monsieur. I also loved that one of the comments was, some of the more uneducated people thought that Carlo died of apoplexy. All the smart people thought it was poison. That is one of the Mrs. Gaskell moments where you can see her winking at us through the text. It's supposed to be coming out of Mary Smith. I'm sure that's totally plausible. I like to believe that that's actually Mrs. Gaskell having a laugh with us. I also thought it was pretty impressive that Mrs. Pole was willing to get teeth pulled to go to get intel from Mr. Hoggins about him being robbed. And then when he tells her that he didn't get robbed, her logic is fantastic. She knows he's lying. And then towards the end of her rant, every mother's son of them wishes to be considered Samson and Solomon rolled into one. Too strong ever to be beaten or discomforted. Too wise ever to be outwitted. Well, my father was a man, and I know the sex pretty well. So it's a beautiful example of a logical fallacy. When he's telling her, no, he was not robbed, her response very confidently is, well, I believe he was robbed. That is an appeal to belief. It's argumentum ad consequentiam or ad populum, depending on the tone of the attitude. And that is just claiming that something must be true or false simply because you believe it, regardless of evidence or reasoning. And this is what the guys on Twiv on the This Week in Virology used to say, the plural of anecdote is not data. Just because you have a whole lot of anecdotes saying that something is true, that does not equal data. The collection of data is a very, very different and complex process, and it is not based on anecdotes of any number. I also loved, oh my gosh, I loved Miss Maddie telling Mary Smith about how she would take a flying leap into bed to try and avoid, the boogeyman. But I also thought her idea of rolling the ball under the bed was genius. I mean, what she was going to do if it came back out, if it bounced back out at her and didn't go all the way through to the other side, was a little on the lame side. But the idea of rolling the ball under the bed was really smart. Oh, and there was one thing I forgot to bring up beforehand. Mrs. Forrester, when she's having, she mentions that she has a hard time getting woken up in the morning sometimes. She says sometimes she has to be cold pigged or piggied in the morning to get out of bed. I am guessing that this is somebody pulling the sheets off the bottom of the bed so that her feet get cold. I do not know if that is true. If anybody has heard that phrase before, please let me know. 206-350-1642, heather@craftlit.com, because that is a colloquialism I have not come across before. And I'm pretty sure I am right, but it could be very funny to find out what it really means if I am wrong. Good stuff. All right. Don't forget that the last Thursday of this month, the month of June 2025, our book party is The Princess Bride. Andrew wanted me to make sure that everybody knows, depending on which edition of the book you get, there might be many, many forewords at the beginning. Don't read any of the newer ones. Only read the last one, the one that's the oldest, the one that actually came out with the original book. He said you can read the first ones after you finish the book, but if you start with them, you'll just confuse yourself. Read the one that's most recent to the original publication date of the book and go from there. And that will all make sense to you if you've already read the book, and it will make sense to you if you've gotten the book and gone, wow, that's a lot of forewords. Yeah, don't worry about it. William Goldman always had a lot to say. And then July will be the watch party for The Princess Bride. And I got to hear Rob Reiner when the movie was not doing well in the movie theaters. Rob Reiner came to UCLA when I was there, and they showed us the movie in the student union. And then afterwards, Rob Reiner told us all sorts of stories about the making of that film, most of which are actually in Carrie L's book, As You Wish, where he actually got favorite stories from everybody else in the cast. If you haven't read that, if you love The Princess Bride and you haven't read that book, don't. Get the audiobook, because anybody who's alive reads their parts. For the most part, anybody that they could get reads their parts. Obviously, Andre the Giant, not there to read his parts. And instead of him having stories in the book, people tell stories about him in the book, which is lovely. But first, we will start with the book, The Princess Bride. All right, I think that's everything. Don't forget to send crafty videos to us. Don't forget to get yourself some tea at bit.ly/craftlit-pdtea. And don't forget to watch those videos on, or at least listen to those videos on women's credit card history and Victorian traveling trunks, and also Kaz's video on Victorian trains versus modern train travel. They're interesting. And do visit BJ Harrison's audiobook librarycard.com, or, listen to Classic Tales podcast. God, he's good. All right. On that happy note, I leave you. Have a lovely, lovely week. And yeah, I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye. You can find show notes for this episode and links to other episodes at craftlit.com. Craftlit also appears anywhere you can get a podcast: iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and on, including its own dedicated app. There are lots of ways to support Craftlit, from patreon.com/craftlit to craftlit.com memberships and channel memberships on YouTube. You can find out more details at craftlit.com/premium. And as always, thank you for your support. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.